If you're researching EVs, charging apps look overwhelming. There are dozens of them, each tied to a different network and each with its own prices, rules, and its own quirks. It's easy to walk away thinking that owning an EV means managing a phone full of apps just to get around. That impression is understandable, but it's also misleading. So in this episode, I want to explain what charging apps actually do, when they genuinely matter, and just as importantly, when they don't. Because for most EV owners, charging apps feel central long before they're actually relevant. By the end, you should have a clear mental model for how charging apps fit into real EV ownership without the anxiety. Charging apps look like the control panel for EV ownership. They're highly visible during research, they're heavily discussed online, and they're usually introduced before someone ever owns an EV. That creates a subtle inversion. Tools meant for occasional use start to feel like daily requirements. This is the same pattern we see with range anxiety, EPA numbers, and winter performance. Visibility gets mistaken for frequency. Charging apps exist to solve specific problems. They are not the baseline experience for most EV owners. To understand where apps fit, you have to separate EV ownership into two very different models. The first is daily life. So daily life charging is predictable. It's repetitive and it happens in the same place at roughly the same time using the same equipment. For most owners, this means charging at home or a consistent workplace charger. In that mode, charging apps are either irrelevant or completely invisible. The car plugs in, energy flows, and the process fades into the background. The second mode is exception handling. This includes road trips, unfamiliar destinations, apartment living without home charging, or backup plans during extreme cold or unexpected travel. This is where charging apps actually matter, but most confusion comes from treating exception tools as if they define the daily experience. Charging apps feel complicated for three reasons that have nothing to do with how often you'll use them. First, fragmentation. Gas stations are part of a familiar, standardized infrastructure, even if the brands differ. Charging networks don't share that same level of standardization. Each network built its own software layer, which means the ecosystem looks messy even when usage is infrequent. The second problem bias. People don't post about the hundreds of times charging works quietly. They post when something fails, stalls, or requires a workaround. Apps are visible precisely because problems are visible. Then third is pre-ownership exposure. You learn about charging apps before you learn your own driving patterns. That reverses the learning order, and instead of discovering tools as needed, you're handed the entire toolbox up front and told to memorize it. None of that reflects how charging fits into day-to-day ownership for most people. Charging apps become important in a few specific scenarios, however. Road trips are the obvious one because planning stops, checking availability, and confirming pricing all happen before you arrive. In that context, apps reduce uncertainty and help you make better decisions. Apartment living is another. Without a dedicated charger, public infrastructure becomes part of your routine, and apps help locate, access, and manage those chargers. Cold weather can also elevate app usage temporarily. Reduced range, slower charging, and contingency planning make visibility more useful, even if it's only seasonally. In all those situations, though, apps are serving as situational tools. They're not really your permanent companions. Many owners download 5 or 6 charging apps immediately, create accounts, add payment methods, and then wait for the scenario that may never arrive. This feels responsible, but it often amplifies anxiety rather than reducing it. Most drivers will rely on one primary charging contact most of the time. Everything else is backup. So treating backup systems as daily systems creates unnecessary cognitive load, and you end up managing tools instead of driving patterns. Here's a more accurate way to think about charging apps without oversimplifying the experience. Charging itself can be routine or situational depending on how and where you live. For people who charge at home or at a consistent workplace, charging quickly becomes background infrastructure. In those cases, apps rarely play an active role once things are all set up. For people who rely on public charging as part of their regular routine, apartment residents, city drivers, or anyone without home access, apps function more like access keys and visibility tools. They're part of the system, not an occasional add-on. The important distinction isn't private versus public charging, it's whether charging is predictable or if it's variable. Charging apps matter most when you need information, access, or flexibility. They matter less when charging is repeatable and familiar, regardless of where it happens. A simple contrast can help clarify this. For someone charging in a garage every night, charging becomes invisible infrastructure. The app may exist, but it fades into the background once the routine is established. For someone who relies on the same public charger each week, an apartment resident or an urban driver, charging can be just as routine, but the app stays visible, not because charging is harder, but because access, availability, and confirmation are part of the process. In both cases, charging is predictable. What changes is how much information has to stay in view. Charging apps often sit downstream of range anxiety even when they aren't the cause of it. Concerns about range are real for many people, whether or not they turn out to be justified over time. When those concerns are present, anything that adds visibility or complexity can feel emotionally heavier than it is functionally. In that context, apps can feel like proof that EV ownership is complicated even when they're simply tools for managing uncertainty. The anxiety isn't created by the software, but the software often becomes where the anxiety shows up. Separating emotional concerns from practical tools can help, and charging apps don't define how far the car goes. They help you plan, adapt, or confirm when you're operating outside familiar patterns. You don't need to treat charging apps like a certification process. You don't need to optimize them before you understand your own driving. And you don't need to assume that visible complexity equals frequent complexity. The vast majority of EV charging happens quietly without an app ever being opened. Charging apps are best understood as tools for managing variability. They're useful when charging conditions change, when access isn't guaranteed, or when planning matters more than habit. For some drivers, that's occasional, and for others, especially those who rely on public infrastructure day to day, that's routine. And apps are simply part of how charging works. What matters is understanding the role they play in your situation rather than assuming they define EV ownership as a whole. When you see charging apps as support tools instead of a constant requirement, the system feels more grounded and easier to reason about. This is Wrench and Reason, where we explain how modern cars actually work. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.